I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. The year 2025 marks the 10th anniversary of China's digital Silk Road, which has become an increasingly crucial component of Xi Jinping's flagship foreign policy project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Over the past decade, China has massively expanded its digital infrastructure investment across the globe. Accompanying the investment has been the diffusion of China's digital governance norms and standards in recipient states. Countries in the Indo-Pacific have been at the forefront of this stretching Chinese digital influence landscape. The conflation between digital development cooperation and digital governance norms adoption has far-reaching implications that need to be better understood and addressed. To discuss this issue, I'm pleased to welcome as my guest today Michael Castor, who is head of Global China Program at Article 19, an NGO that advances freedom of opinion and expression. And his organization has published 2 reports recently examining China's digital Silk Road. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Michael.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Excited to be here.
Well, China's digital Silk Road was launched, as I said, 2015, 10 years ago. And its role in the Belt and Road Initiative overall has grown in importance, especially since the third Belt and Road Forum, which was held in October 2023. So can you briefly tell us what are Beijing's digital Silk Road goals, and why is it seeking to promote PRC-led global digital infrastructure and governance?
And I think it's helpful to think about the digital Silk Road more as an umbrella concept that encompasses evolving digital policies and priorities under the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Rather than as a distinct foreign policy objective on its own. And so, while it was called into existence in 2015, as you mentioned, references to a digital Silk Road appeared really a year earlier in a paper from the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which really first started calling for China to fold digital information activities into the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, it cited some that had predated the Belt and Road Initiative, and today, a number of projects that are now considered as part of larger digital Silk Road activities, again, obviously predated by a number of years, but this is similar to some of the BRI projects that also obviously predated BRI, but have been wrapped up into it. 2014 was also the year that we saw the Cyberspace Administration of China being sort of reformed or rebranded from the earlier version of the State Internet Information Office. And so, I mentioned some of these because the National Development and Reform Commission, which sort of pushed out first that white paper in 2015, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology and the Cyberspace Administration of China have really been key institutions, both domestically, but also in pushing out digital Silk Road cooperation, particularly in the digital governance space. Key institutions along with other party state institutions, and then, of course, the national tech champions like Huawei and Alibaba and others. But, to your question, I think that understanding PRC goals under the digital Silk Road, it's not actually that difficult because they've laid it out quite plainly for us in opinions, policies, strategies, and planning documents over the years. One is certainly the prioritization at the infrastructure level. So fiber optic, submarine cables, satellite infrastructure, 5G, things like this, new and emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, of course, smart city technologies. And then in the governance domain, what we've really seen is an emphasis on China playing a leading role in developing internet and other digital governance. Some of the places where they've placed a priority is on cybercrime and cybersecurity norms. And then, of course, especially the China Standards 2035 policy, which has been referenced in a number also of digital Silk Road related documents over the years, which positions China as a leader in global technical standards setting. But over the last 10 years, we've often seen that China places a particular strategic priority on South and Southeast Asia within the DSR framework for partnerships And so that really understanding what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, we have argued, is critical for understanding also China's global ambitions under the Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road. The third Belt and Road Initiative Forum that happened in 2023 that you mentioned, right before it, they released a white paper which summarized a number of the successes of the Digital Silk Road to date, which plugged in again a number of those issues that I mentioned above. And during the forum, Xi Jinping also stressed, moving away from the massive infrastructure projects of the first decade of the Belt and Road Initiative to a focus on the small yet smart or small yet beautiful projects, which really encapsulates a lot of the digital components to that. And so I really think we're going to see a greater emphasis under Belt and Road cooperation on the digital domain.
So, how would you describe China's digital governance norms that it promotes abroad, and how do they spread them in various countries?
Sure, thanks. So, in our latest report, which really focused on cybersecurity governance, but we identify three digital governance norms. So, cyber sovereignty, multilateralism, and the securitization of digital development. Arguably, the sort of foundational digital governance norm for China is this notion of cyber sovereignty, which is not a new concept. It goes back to the 2010 white paper on the internet in China. That 2010 white paper also lays out multilateralism as a key norm. But over the years, we've seen a number of places increasingly and consistently where China cites cyber sovereignty as this guiding norm for its digital governance. Ironically, perhaps the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2023 put out its position on global digital governance, which claims that China is in opposition to internet fragmentation, but really the norm of cyber sovereignty, because it positions states' ability to impose laws at the national level really unaccountable to global norms when it comes to internet governance space. This is the same type of practice that precipitates fragmentation and is really very alarming for that reason. The second norm that we identify is this issue of multilateralism. And here really it's about positioning China in cooperation with other state-to-state or state groupings. So working through ASEAN or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and others, and really shying away from multi-stakeholderism as an engagement or as a digital governance norm-setting platform, which has a number of alarming ramifications. And finally, the securitization of digital development. One of the main concerns here with this normative approach is that in seeing digital development really as synonymous with securitization of the entire online information space, it's likely to lead to digital governance norms that will infringe on greater freedom of expression and right to privacy, really by securitizing not just the information infrastructure, but the whole of the information space. And we really, again, see this as how the Cyberspace Administration of China operates still very much a part of the Central Propaganda Department. And so it's not just about the governance of the information space, it's also about the control of information. And so perhaps to look at sort of how these norms have been diffused in the region, one of the country case studies that we explored in our recent report is Vietnam. And in particular, we see how over more than a decade, Vietnamese high-level officials within the Vietnamese Communist Party have explicitly cited learning from China's digital governance norms. Vietnam was an early adopter of the cyber sovereignty narrative. Less than 2 years after the 2010 white paper, so in 2012, Vietnam had already established a military department with the mandate of protecting national information sovereignty in cyberspace. And since then, we've seen a number of places where not just the Vietnamese senior leadership have explicitly pointed to having learned from and emulating China's digital governance norms, but in particular with the cybersecurity law in Vietnam, which came out about a year after China's. We actually see a number of articles are almost word for word. They're replicating verbatim what China's cybersecurity law has said. And so this raises, I think, a number of stark examples of how in context where I think a lot of observers don't necessarily associate the close influence between China and Vietnam, but we've actually seen very close learning from China and emulating its digital governance norms in Vietnam.
In addition to Vietnam, your report also looked at Pakistan and Indonesia. And of course, Indonesia is a very different case than I think Vietnam and Pakistan. Maybe you can give us a better understanding of how China's approaches in those countries differ and how their digital footprint differs, and how do China's digital infrastructure investments relate to its effort to promote these Chinese digital governance norms and standards in these countries?
Yeah, so between the two reports, we've looked at Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, Thailand, and Vietnam. And so really, I mean, understandably, China's digital footprint varies widely between, say, Pakistan and Cambodia, where it's most pronounced. And, if we look at the China Index ranking from the Doublethink Lab, Cambodia and Pakistan are, ranked, or rather, Pakistan and Cambodia are ranked first and second, really in terms of China's global influence. And then we compare that perhaps to Indonesia and Malaysia, where it's much different. We've seen actual fluctuation from one administration to the next. With Malaysia in particular, over the years, changing administrations have really taken very different positions. For example, on the use of Chinese technology for the rollout of its own 5G technology. But I might then maybe just point to Cambodia, Nepal, and Vietnam as a little bit of understanding kind of where the digital footprint is and how we see this playing out within some of the larger ecosystem. Of course, in Cambodia, as I mentioned, China's presence is really pronounced at every layer of the digital stack. Cambodia's recent digital government policy, 2022 to 2035, it explicitly mentions China as a case study that the Cambodian government sees as a successful example of digital government. Cambodia's infrastructure is heavily reliant on Chinese providers, and the country's really been ramping up, particularly through fiber optic landing stations in Sihanoukville, which have connections with this relatively secret naval base at Reem, and in other places where, with Cambodia, we really see some of the most alarming examples of where digital Silk Road cooperation are coming hand in hand with the digital infrastructure and then adopting more repressive digital governance norms, and can hopefully get to that a little bit later. With Nepal, which joined the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017, China and Nepal have collaborated more in some traditional infrastructure, so transportation infrastructure, but increasingly also with digital infrastructure. Several years ago, Xi Jinping stressed the need for more cooperation between Nepal and China to advance cooperation around digital economy and connectivity. And in 2023, Nepal's prime minister urged development partners, particularly calling on China, to provide support to help Nepal graduate from least developed country status by 2026. And a lot of this is through cooperation, financial support from China in various digital development needs. Now, unfortunately, one thing that we've identified is that with Nepal seeking financial and other technical support from China in developing its digital infrastructure, it has often also come with promises from Nepal to China to adhere to the One China policy and explicit promises from the Nepali government to help to tamp down on the Tibetan population in Nepal in what appears to be a sort of quid pro quo for receiving support from China for digital and other development needs to restrict really some of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the the Tibetan population in Nepal. And then finally, with Vietnam, as I mentioned already, we've seen a lot of clear indications where Vietnam has learned from China following particularly around some of the cybersecurity governance norms. And I think why this is so important actually to highlight is, again, that certain policymakers and analysts in the West have pointed to Vietnam as a bulwark against China's rise in the region, as a destination for some of the de-risking in technology supply chain as certain companies move away from China. But really, what we've identified in this latest report is that Vietnam is really also following China's footsteps in the application of sort of digital authoritarian or digital repressive tactics, learning from them even in their own words. And so we would push back a bit on positioning Vietnam as a bulwark to China's influence in the region. And I think also why it's quite important to, draw attention to this about Vietnam is that later this year in July, Vietnam will host the signing of the UN Cybercrime Convention, which is problematic for a number of reasons, but we're worried that it will not only potentially whitewash some of Vietnam's record, but effectively further sort of normalize some of these digital governance norms and cybercrime and cybersecurity standards that we're seeing from China. And so we definitely would caution more, nuanced take on the relationship between Vietnam and China.
If we look at the reasons why countries are attracted to Chinese digital solutions, and you've looked at a lot of countries, it sounds to me like there's probably differences among some of these countries. So is it primarily in some places maybe because these options that China provides they're cheap? They're maybe is it because there aren't other digital solutions? And in some of the countries that you've mentioned, my guess is that they're actually attracted to the authoritarian norms that China's providing. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Many countries in the global majority, of course, not just in the Indo-Pacific that we've looked most closely with this research, but they have a real digital development need, and there are right to connectivity challenges. One of the difficulties certainly is that there are few actors that have the scale to address these challenges, and that China is one that often comes in with the cheapest solutions, leading some countries to forego security or human rights concerns, again, for a more economical option from China. Of course, certainly, yes, there are a number that are attracted to this more digital authoritarian model, who just prefer to work with China to build out their infrastructure and the sort of censorship and surveillance capabilities that comes. But others, sadly, are really slowly won over to these norms and models out of first necessity. In sort of pushing back on some of this, of course, what we would like to see is other, particularly state actors like Japan to increase their support for digital development as part of their broader development portfolio. And again, obviously, Japan has already promised to incorporate more of the digital into their development portfolio. The EU's Global Gateway Initiative, which is, again, positioned as a counter to some of China's larger Belt and Road Initiative projects. But again, we would really like to see greater emphasis within the Global Gateway to support digital infrastructure, but doing so with robust, human rights safeguards, transparency, and others enshrined. And then, of course, the US, which has provided support for a number of these initiatives also in the past. Sadly, previously, some of them were already, not funded enough to really compete with China. But right now, unfortunately, again, we're in a situation where, due to some of the foreign aid terminations, a number of these projects were US aid funded. And so I think further we're risking, seeing China claiming actually greater territory within the digital infrastructure and digital governance space.
Some of the major Chinese high-tech companies like Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba have been actively participating in the digital Silk Road. What roles have these companies played in promoting China's digital governance norms and standards in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think I would just sort of, also emphasize the united front responsibilities that China's national tech champions have here. Of course, Huawei and ZTE are critical players in like 5G and Alibaba with e-commerce. But perhaps just as critical, to the party, these companies have also played a role in promoting China's norms, as you say. We discussed this in our previous report a lot in looking at some of the party directives on tech companies, the role of party organizations within tech companies, and then how that has influenced their participation and what they promote through the digital Silk Road. So really emblematic of this directive goes back to 2020, when the Party Central Committee put out its opinions on strengthening the united front work of the private economy in the new era. This really sought to expand party leadership over what private sector, was doing, and in particular placed a premium on ideological and political instruction to shape how the sort of erstwhile private, companies, were engaging, and in particular to optimize, private sector in the strategic emerging industries, which of course this is the high tech sector, to promote them to unswervingly follow the party. And so this really includes how they have participated in and engaged in different digital Silk Road projects. In particular, again, the directive is for them to, and I'm reading this as a quote, to actively participate in the Belt and Road construction, consciously safeguard national interests, and establish a good image of Chinese private enterprises, end quote. And so again, really what we see is that these same national tech champions that are involved in rolling out some of the tools, the technologies themselves, have been tasked with the party to play also a leading role in narrative shaping, information control, promoting China's objectives here, which a lot of this, again, as we have noted, is about promoting its own norms as best practices and really reshaping international best practices to the point where they align with party priorities.
Do you have a way of assessing how effective China has been across the set of countries that you look at? And maybe do you have some sense as to why they're more effective in some countries than others?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons for success is contexts with less transparency and already more restrictive environments for an independent media or civil society, or again the embrace of this renouncing of multi-stakeholderism, where we see tech companies, both domestic and foreign, academia, civil society, media, being able to work together to identify and to document, what is taking place on the ground. A lot of the MOUs, cooperation agreements, that China has engaged in through digital Silk Road partnerships have been opaque by design. And this really makes it more difficult to expose where human rights concerns are, where national security concerns are. And so, of course, in contexts that already are marked by endemic lack of transparency or civil society safeguards and freedoms, we do tend to see, less ability to push back and to challenge some of this.
You note in the report that one of the defining features of the PRC's influence in these countries is what you call the adoption of the state-driven surveillance and censorship mechanism. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that look like, and why is it a threat? Just to be more concrete.
Absolutely. I think, one of the most alarming examples of that is this creeping normalization of China's Great Firewall in the region, in countries that are really closely engaged with digital cooperation. And so we've seen this in varying forms in Cambodia, Nepal, Pakistan, and Thailand. And, we cover this in the two reports. In Thailand, going back to 2015, after the military coup there, the then Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, which is now the Ministry of Digital Economy and Society, in 2015, they called for the creation of what they were calling a single internet gateway, to control, access to and the flow of information, particularly from abroad. It was, panned by civil society, with a lot of the Thai activists calling it the Great Firewall of Thailand. And a few months after it was proposed, it was abandoned. But again, in 2022, the Ministry of Digital Economy and Society in Thailand, which again is a ministry that is very closely aligned with a number of Chinese institutions, such as the Cyberspace Administration of China, again in 2022, it raised, it mused establishing a single internet gateway. It's sort of been stalled, but it's certainly been proposed several times. In Nepal in 2023, in late 2023, Nepal passed its national cybersecurity policy, which, among other things, really echoes sort of this China firewall in calling for the need of a government-owned intranet and the establishment of a national internet gateway. Concerningly, while Nepal had made the national cybersecurity policy available for public consultation ahead of time, this provision calling for a national internet gateway was left out of all previous versions that were seen by civil society. And in line with some of the other places where we see some alignment, there are really big concerns about, again, adopting this approach. Now, again, this is a policy and not a law or a technical framework, but it does point a bit towards that normative creep in Nepal. And in Cambodia, in 2021, the National Internet Gateway Subdecree was passed. So the law is there, but the technical capabilities are not up to where the law calls upon the state to impose really what is very clear in the language of the subdecree, a China-style firewall. But what we are seeing, of course, is China providing technical support through more enhanced bandwidth capability for fiber optic landing stations. And Huawei is partnering with the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications, we believe, again, lack of transparency here, to build out a T4 data center in Phnom Penh, which would handle much higher degrees of data. So it looks that Cambodia is slowly in the process of building out the technologies to implement the law. And then finally, with Pakistan last year, the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority called for a revamping of its web management system to include things like more advanced deep packet inspection technology, which is incredibly concerning from a surveillance perspective, but also the PTA is responsible for a lot of internet censorship. And what they're looking at doing with this revamped firewall is to, again, really supercharge some of the surveillance and censorship capabilities. While the public tenders have kind of gone back and forth and pointing to wanting or not wanting Chinese technology, and there's been some, miscommunication, a lot of the signs from the experts in Pakistan do point to close collaboration between Pakistan authorities and Chinese in building out, again, this China-style firewall. And so I think here is this normative shift that we're seeing really that is incredibly concerning.
China's BeiDou navigation satellite system also made impressive inroads into many of these regional countries. What are the national security implications for countries adopting the BeiDou system?
Yeah, so the BeiDou satellite navigation system has military and commercial properties, and it's part of China's great power competition with the U.S.-led Global Positioning System, or GPS. And by a lot of indicators, BeiDou is winning out with a lot of countries adopting BeiDou over GPS. And so, this is obviously quite concerning. What we're seeing in the region is some of the first countries outside of China to sign up to use the BeiDou navigation system. So Thailand in 2013, and then Pakistan a year later. And China has positioned this spatial infrastructure, going back to around 2016. Spatial information infrastructure, going back to around 2016, again, as a priority under, the Digital Silk Road cooperation. And so within the imaging capabilities of BeiDou, it does raise a number of both human rights and national security challenges. One is that a U.S. Department of Defense report from a couple of years ago actually pointed out that in some regions, BeiDou imaging is a lot more granular even than GPS or some of the other, Western satellite imaging systems, which raises questions about the surveillance capabilities that it has in those regions. But another is that the BeiDou satellite system is linked to the BeiDou Smart Police Terminal system, which allows for police to synchronize a number of functions along with digital ID verification, building recognition, and others, syncing it up to terminals that can process this information in real time. Cambodia is one country that has really increasingly aligned with the BeiDou satellite navigation and other satellite technologies, which I think also is raising a number of concerns around surveillance and right to privacy, as well as, of course, from national security perspectives, as we've noted that one of the main ground stations in Cambodia, again, is in the sort of secretive naval base at Ream. And from a satellite internet infrastructure perspective, in addition to BeiDou, China's Guowang system is also seeking to develop out more to provide, again, really kind of a competition to Starlink and SpaceX low Earth orbit satellite internet infrastructure. As of now, they're awaiting a spectrum allocation from the International Telecommunications Union for a massive low Earth orbiting satellite constellation. And again, there's some real questions that this raises about connecting satellite internet infrastructure to, among other things, the Great Firewall approach to internet governance, which is part of what I was talking about earlier with this approach to really censorship and surveillance at the infrastructure level.
So finally, you talked a little bit about Europe's Global Gateway program and about Japan's effort in this regard to also provide solutions to some countries in the region. And of course, this is taking place not only in some places in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Africa. Um, is there anything else you can add about what governments in the region, or of course the United States, could or should do to respond? I guess it's probably self-evident that these countries don't have the level of resources that China, or maybe they have them, but they have different priorities, and they're unwilling or unlikely to put in the kind of resources that China has actually devoted to the digital Silk Road. So, what can you propose as policy responses? Is there potential for coordination among some of these democracies that are concerned about the national security implications of Chinese efforts in the digital Silk Road?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you answered your own question a little bit there. I would agree with a lot of what you said. Perhaps just to reiterate that, definitely for those countries that have the means to do so, we would like to see greater support for digital development. So whether that's the US, Japan, or blocs like the EU, and then in cooperation between states in particular, where you have countries with major infrastructure providers like Ericsson, for example, which has been a key player also in the 5G, in parts of the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere, cooperating with other companies and other countries, where individually perhaps the resources or the political will isn't there. But within all of this process, of course, not just freeing more resources, because this is not just about financial competition. We also want to ensure that there is transparency and there is cooperation and partnership. Through transparency, we seek to see robust human rights due diligence within this process, and of course, mainstreaming of internet freedom principles as well as human rights principles to ensure that we have not just the infrastructure laid to contest what China is doing through the digital Silk Road, but also to ensure that we're pushing back or holding the line on the certain digital governance norms. We want to see ongoing embrace of multi-stakeholderism, ensuring that inclusivity of not just state actors, but civil society, tech sector, private sector, technical expertise, academia, and so forth. And just to ensure that as we are developing, digital needs, that we are also doing so and ensuring that, the internet remains free, open, and interoperable.
We've been talking with Michael Castor, who is the head of the Global China Program at Article 19, which is an NGO that advances freedom of opinion and expression. Thanks so much for being with us, Michael, and for your important work.
Thanks a lot, Bonnie. It was a pleasure.